Every man at some point stares down that long, hard road and wonders if he's got enough left in the tank. It's a quiet question, one that whispers when the house is dark and the only sound is the tick of the clock. A question Hank knew intimately for far too long. Hank was 48, a factory man through and through. He looked like a man who'd carried more than just tools his whole life. His broad shoulders, slightly stooped, spoke of physical burdens, sure, but his deep-set eyes, weary yet stubborn, held a heavier, unseen weight. They didn't give up, not exactly, but they'd seen too many sunrises from the wrong side of a window. His hands, though, those told a different story. Calloused, scarred, perpetually ingrained with grease, they were maps of every hard day's work, testament to a quiet strength, a refusal to ever let go of what he was gripping. They were the hands of a man who just kept showing up. Every man at some point stares down that long, hard road and wonders if he's got enough left in the tank. It's a quiet question, one that whispers when the house is dark and the only sound is the tick of the clock. A question Hank knew intimately for far too long. Hank was 48, a factory man through and through. He looked like a man who'd carried more than just tools his whole life. His broad shoulders, slightly stooped, spoke of physical burdens, sure, but his deep-set eyes, weary yet stubborn, held a heavier, unseen weight. They didn't give up, not exactly, but they'd seen too many sunrises from the wrong side of a window. His hands, though, those told a different story. Calloused, scarred, perpetually ingrained with grease, they were maps of every hard day's work, testament to a quiet strength, a refusal to ever let go of what he was gripping. They were the hands of a man who just kept showing up. His world began with the shrill, unapologetic buzz of an alarm clock at 5:00 a.m., 5 days a week, sometimes 6. It was a sound that had burrowed itself into his bones, a signal to rise before the sun, before the coffee had even finished dripping. A quick shower, the same worn mug filled with lukewarm coffee, a silent nod to Sarah still asleep in their modest bedroom. Then into the chill pre-dawn, the reliable old pickup sputtering to life, its exhaust a puff of gray against the blue-black sky. The drive was always the same. Familiar turns, silent streets, the growing industrial glow on the horizon like some distant, unwelcoming beacon. The factory floor was a symphony of clang and hum, a constant, churning beast of metal and steam that Hank knew intimately. He was a master of its moods, its groans, its inevitable breakdowns. His job was to coax life back into tired machinery, to patch, to tighten, to replace, to ensure the conveyor belts kept rolling, the presses kept stamping, the production quotas kept climbing. Day in, day out, the same motions, the same problems, just presented differently. His mind, after so many years, could almost run on autopilot, freeing his thoughts to drift, though often they'd just circle back to the hum of the machines. He worked to keep the lights on in that small, well-maintained house on the edge of town, to ensure Emily had enough for her community college textbooks, and Mark could still play soccer without asking where the money came from. The mortgage, the utility bills, the ever-increasing cost of, well, everything. It was a constant weight, a ledger in his head that never quite balanced, no matter how many overtime shifts he took. Sarah worked part-time at the hardware store doing her bit, but the bulk of it always fell to Hank, the quiet, dependable provider. He never complained aloud, not really. That wasn't his way. His sacrifices were just part of the deal, part of being a man, a husband, a father. But beneath the surface of that quiet dependability, a different kind of weariness had taken root, one that sleep couldn't cure. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion from a double shift or the financial squeeze that kept him awake some nights. It was the dull ache of unlived moments, the faint echo of a young man's dreams long buried under the grime of factory dust. Hank remembered wanting more, though he'd be hard-pressed to articulate what that more even was any more. He'd wanted to fix things, sure, but maybe something other than broken presses. Maybe to build. Maybe to create. Maybe just to feel like he was moving forward, not just endlessly treading water in the same gray pond. He saw the gap, wide and deep, between the man he was and the man he'd once quietly hoped to become. The younger Hank had ambition, raw and unrefined, before life had sanded it down to a nub. Now he often felt like a cog in a much larger machine, replaceable, interchangeable. The thought was a bitter pill when he swallowed daily with his lukewarm coffee. That fear of stagnation, that quiet yearning for something more fulfilling, it gnawed at him. He knew he possessed a certain resilience, had always been able to push through, but lately, that resilience felt less like strength and more like a heavy chain, binding him to a path he hadn't truly chosen, just fallen into. He carried it all silently, a solitary burden, convinced that this was simply his lot, his inevitable trajectory. He'd simply been built to endure, not to soar. He'd simply been built to endure, not to soar. And every single morning that endurance was put to the test. The alarm clock on Hank's bedside table was a relic, a brutalist block of plastic that shrieked at 5 a.m. without fail. It wasn't a gentle rise. It was an abrupt tearing from whatever brief respite sleep offered. His feet hit the cold linoleum floor of the small bathroom before his brain had fully caught up, a well-worn path carved by years of habit. Coffee, black and bitter, was gulped down with a piece of toast, eaten standing by the kitchen counter while Sarah still slept, curled under the worn quilt. Emily was off at community college, Mark still deep in his teenage slumber, so the house was quiet, save for the hum of the old refrigerator and the clinking of his spoon in the mug. This was his time, a brief window of solitude before the day truly began, a time not for reflection, but for the quiet marshaling of his internal resources, bracing for the inevitable. The drive to the plant was a blur of pre-dawn streetlights and familiar turns, the same stretch of road he'd traveled for nearly 30 years. He knew every pothole, every crack in the pavement. The factory itself rose out of the gloom like a sleeping beast, an imposing silhouette of corrugated steel and smokestacks against the bruised purple of the coming dawn. Inside, the air was thick with the tang of hydraulic fluid and hot metal, a smell that had long ago stopped registering as unpleasant, simply was. His station on the assembly line, tending to the massive stamping press, was a symphony of repetitive clang and hiss, a rhythm that pounded in his bones, vibrating deep into his skull. Lever down, part slides in, press stamps, part slides out. Repeat, hour after hour, day after day. His hands, calloused and ingrained with grease, moved with an automatic precision born of endless repetition, muscle memory doing the work while his mind drifted, often to nowhere at all. The monotony was a slow erosion, a constant drip that wore down the sharper edges of his spirit. He knew the numbers, too, the mortgage statement that seemed to inch up despite his best efforts. The car repair bill tucked under a magnet on the fridge. Emily's tuition, small as it was, still a steady drain. Mark would be looking at colleges soon, or maybe a trade school, and Hank felt the unspoken pressure, the need to keep this worn-out machine running to ensure a better start for his kids than he'd had. The bills weren't just paper. They were heavy, palpable chains, anchoring him to the press, to the hum, to the unrelenting schedule. He never complained, not aloud, but the weight of it all was etched into the lines around his eyes, the slight slump in his shoulders that even his quiet strength couldn't quite straighten out. Beneath the surface of his quiet dependability, a different kind of weariness had taken root, one that sleep couldn't cure. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion from a double shift or the financial squeeze that kept him awake some nights. It was the dull ache of unlived moments, the faint echo of a young man's dreams long buried under the grime of factory dust. Hank remembered wanting more, though he'd be hard-pressed to articulate what that more even was any more. He'd wanted to fix things, sure, but maybe something other than broken presses. Maybe to build. Maybe to create. Maybe just to feel like he was moving forward, not just endlessly treading water in the same gray pond. He saw the gap wide and deep between the man he was and the man he'd once quietly hoped to become. The younger Hank had ambition, raw and unrefined, before life had sanded it down to a nub. Now he often felt like a cog in a much larger machine, replaceable, interchangeable. The thought was a bitter pill when he swallowed daily with his lukewarm coffee. That fear of stagnation, that quiet yearning for something more fulfilling, it gnawed at him. He knew he possessed a certain resilience, had always been able to push through, but lately, that resilience felt less like strength and more like a heavy chain, binding him to a path he hadn't truly chosen, just fallen into. He carried it all silently, a solitary burden, convinced that this was simply his lot, his inevitable trajectory. He'd simply been built to endure, not to soar. But in the quiet hours of his shift, when the noise of the plant became a monotonous hum and his thoughts could momentarily escape the immediate task, he'd find himself staring at a blank spot on the wall, a phantom itch behind his eyes. It was the ghost of a different life, a whispered what if that had never been given the chance to speak aloud. He pushed it down always. What was the point? His world was here now in the relentless rhythm of the machine, the weight of the bills, the silent obligation to his family. This was his power, he thought, this ability to simply keep showing up, even when every fiber of his being screamed for something else, something undefinable, something more. It was a quiet kind of defeat, a surrender to the path of least resistance disguised as responsibility. He saw his own reflection sometimes in the polished steel of a machine part, a tired man with weary eyes, and recognized a resignation there, a fading of the light that gnawed at him in ways the clang of the press never could. He felt trapped, not just by circumstance, but by his own inability to voice the unarticulated longing that festered beneath his stoic exterior. It was a Tuesday night, deep into the graveyard shift. The air in the plant was thick with the metallic tang of coolant and the persistent drone of machinery, a symphony Hank had known for decades. Tonight, though, the melody was off-key. Number 4 press, an old hydraulic beast known for its stubbornness, had jammed again. He'd been wrestling with it for hours, his wrenches heavy in his calloused hands, his back a protesting knot of muscle. Every adjustment, every turn of a bolt felt like an act of futility. He tightened the last fitting, wiped grease from his forehead with the back of a hand, and flipped the power switch. The machine groaned, shuddered, and then with an infuriating hiss stalled out once more. A wave of exhaustion, so profound it felt physical, washed over him. It wasn't just tired bones. It was a soul-deep weariness that threatened to collapse him right there on the oil-stained concrete. He leaned against the cold steel of the press, letting his head loll back, staring blankly at the overhead fluorescent lights. In the dim reflection of a grime-streaked panel of the dormant machine, he caught a glimpse of himself. It wasn't just a tired face staring back. It was a face etched with something far more disturbing. Resignation. The kind of look that said, "This is it. This is all there is." His shoulders were slumped, his eyes shadowed hollows, and for a fleeting, terrifying second he saw his father and his father's father reflected in that same defeated posture. But then something shifted. A spark, small and insistent, flickered in the cavern of his chest. It wasn't anger at the machine or at his boss or even at his life circumstances. It was a cold, quiet fury at the reflection itself, at the man who was silently accepting that this fading light was his final act. No, a voice whispered, deep and unyielding. Not today, not ever. He might be stuck in this plant, he might be covered in grease, but he wasn't going to quit on himself. Not like this. That tired, resigned man in the reflection was not going to be the end of Hank's story. He pushed away from the machine, a new kind of resolve stiffening his spine, even if his body still screamed for rest. The machine was still broken, but something fundamental inside Hank had just been repaired. He clocked out at 3:15, the pre-dawn air biting at his exposed skin as he walked to his old pickup. The drive home was a blur of empty streets and the hum of worn tires on asphalt. He let himself in silently, the house a dark, quiet sanctuary. Sarah was asleep, her even breathing a soft rhythm from their bedroom. Mark was probably lost in some teenage dream, Emily miles away at college. Hank, however, found no such peace. The quiet of the house amplified the frantic hum in his own head. He walked into the kitchen, the pale glow of the digital clock on the microwave reflecting in the polished countertop. 3:47 a.m. Too early for coffee, too late for sleep. He just stood there, hands on the cool ceramic of the sink. The image of that defeated reflection still burned behind his eyes. He felt raw, stripped bare. What had his life become? A tireless grind, a constant effort to keep his head above water, to provide. All good things, noble even. But where was he in all of it? He closed his eyes, and the memories came unbidden. A younger Hank, full of bluster and half-baked plans, sketching out designs for furniture he'd never build, dreaming of opening his own little workshop. A Hank who believed in the limitless possibilities of a strong back and a determined mind. That Hank felt like a stranger now, a character in a faded photograph. He'd chosen stability, chosen responsibility, chosen the predictable path, one wrench turn at a time. And somewhere along the way, he'd chosen it so thoroughly that he'd forgotten he even had a choice. He hadn't just settled, he'd disappeared into the settlement. A profound sadness settled over him, heavy as a shroud. Not self-pity, but a brutal, unvarnished assessment of the gap between the man he was and the man he'd once hoped to be. He'd been so busy showing up for everyone else, for the mortgage, for the grocery bills, for the broken machine, that he hadn't shown up for himself in years. He'd mistaken endurance for strength and a steady pulse for a beating heart. The quiet fury from the plant hadn't dissipated. It had matured, evolving into a quiet, cold determination. He couldn't go back and change the past, but he could damn sure decide what happened next. The exhaustion was still there, but now a thin, sharp edge of resolve cut through it. He just knew with an absolute certainty that chilled him to the bone that he couldn't keep going on this way. The old way? Not anymore. That quiet fury, it wasn't about the broken machine anymore. It was about him. About the man who'd let himself get chipped away piece by piece by the demands of the clock and the bills and the silent expectations until he was hardly recognizable even to himself. Looking at his reflection that night, the weariness wasn't just physical. It was soul-deep, a resignation that had begun to define him. And in that moment, something clicked. Not a loud, dramatic snap, but a quiet, firm locking into place. Enough, he murmured into the empty house, the word barely a whisper against the hum of the old refrigerator. It wasn't a cry of despair, not really. It was a statement, a boundary drawn in the sand of his own life. Enough of the automatic movements, enough of the endless deferrals, enough of the slow, quiet surrender. He didn't know what enough meant he would do next. He had no grand plan, no sudden inspiration to quit his job or buy a sailboat. There was no lightning bolt, just a deep, undeniable certainty that the way he was going, it couldn't be his only way anymore. This quiet enough was a promise to himself, a defiant refusal to let the current run him aground entirely. He would keep showing up, yes, but he wouldn't let showing up be the sum total of his existence. He refused to quit on the man he knew deep down he still was. The alarm shrilled at 5:00 a.m. like it always did. For years, Hank's hand had automatically found the snooze button, granting him another 9 minutes of oblivion before the inevitable drag out of bed. But this morning, something was different. The sound still grated, still promised the familiar ache of a new day, but Hank's hand didn't move. He lay there, eyes open, staring at the dimly lit ceiling. That quiet promise from the night before echoed in his head, cold and clear. Enough. Don't quit on yourself. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, the familiar stiffness protesting. The old routine tugged at him, a comfortable, well-worn path through the dim house, a cup of instant coffee, and out the door. His mind, still half asleep, tried to argue, to rationalize the familiar. Just today, one more day the old way, but the other voice, the stubborn one, held firm. Not today, not ever. Instead of going straight for the coffee, Hank paused. He walked into the small garage, pulling the light chain. Dust motes danced in the solitary bulb's glow, illuminating the clutter. Tools hung on pegboards. A faint smell of oil and sawdust lingered from projects long abandoned or never started. In the corner, under a tarp, sat the old oak dresser he'd promised Sarah he'd fix years ago. A broken drawer slide, a loose handle. Minor things, but they represented so much more. A wave of exhaustion, heavy and almost physical, washed over him. The urge to turn off the light, retreat to the kitchen, and just go through the motions was immense. It would be so much easier, so much less effort. He could almost hear the whisper, "What's the point, Hank? It's just a dresser. One small thing won't change anything." He fought it. He stood there, hands in his pockets, breathing slowly. The stubbornness that usually served him only on the factory floor, pushing through a particularly difficult repair, now turned inward. He wouldn't quit on this, not today. He wouldn't let the inertia win. It was a small, silent battle, fought in the dim light of his garage against his own ingrained habits and the crushing weight of his weariness. He walked over to the dresser, pulled back the tarp, and ran a calloused hand over the worn wood. He didn't pick up a tool, not yet. But he looked at it, truly looked at it, and a flicker of something long dormant stirred within him. A quiet, defiant spark. He made his coffee later, but it tasted different. Not because of the beans, but because of the small, almost imperceptible shift inside him. The day still loomed, long and grueling, but for the first time in years, Hank wasn't just enduring its arrival. He had met it on his own terms, however small. He'd shown up for himself, and that felt like a beginning. He'd shown up for himself, and that felt like a beginning. That feeling, though it was a fragile thing, like a fresh paint job on an old rust bucket, looks good for a bit, but the underlying rot ain't gone just because you slapped some gloss over it. The shift started long as any other. The conveyor belt clanked, the air smelled of oil and metal, and Hank moved through his tasks, his body on autopilot. He fixed the jammed arm on the assembly line, swapped out a worn bearing, reset a temperamental sensor. He worked with the same quiet efficiency as always, but beneath the surface, that little spark was flickering, trying to hold its own against the old weariness. By the time the whistle blew and he punched out, the initial glow had faded to a dull ember. His shoulders ached, his feet throbbed, and the thought of the dresser in the garage felt less like a promise and more like another obligation. The easy path, the well-worn groove, pulled at him. Sarah would be watching her shows, Mark likely holed up with his games. He could just collapse on the couch, drift off, let the day bleed into the night without another thought. The whisper came back, insidious, soft. "See, Hank, it was just a moment. Back to normal now." But then he remembered the grime-streaked mirror, the resignation. He remembered that quiet fury. He didn't sprint to the garage, didn't tackle the dresser with renewed vigor. He walked slowly, deliberately. He stripped off his work shirt, splashed water on his face, then headed for the garage. He didn't even turn on the main light, just a small work lamp near the dresser. He picked up a screwdriver, ran his thumb over the rusty head. He didn't fix anything that night, not really. But he stood there for a full 10 minutes holding the tool, just being with the task he'd set for himself. It wasn't a grand victory, but it was a quiet defiance. He hadn't retreated. He'd shown up again. The next few days were a blur of pushing and pulling. The 5 a.m. alarm still screamed, but now there was a small, internal debate every morning. Just 5 more minutes, Hank. What's the rush? He'd force himself up, make his coffee, but sometimes the dresser sat untouched for a full day, or he'd only manage to wipe off some dust before heading inside, defeated by the sheer inertia of his old ways. On day 3, the real test began. He woke up feeling heavy, not just with physical exhaustion, but with a mental fatigue that felt ancient. The thought of the dresser, the very idea of trying to be better, felt like a monumental weight. He skipped the coffee ritual in the garage. He barely looked at the dresser as he passed it on the way to the car. All day at the factory, he felt a familiar dullness creeping back in, a sense of having failed already. He ate a cold sandwich at lunch, staring blankly at the wall, the old discontent a familiar ache in his chest. That evening, he nearly gave in completely. He sat on the couch, remote in hand, flicking through channels. Sarah asked him about his day, and he just grunted, not meeting her eyes. He felt the pull of the easy escape, the mind-numbing television, the early sleep that wasn't restful. He just wanted to be invisible. The dresser felt like a phantom limb, a task he'd promised himself he'd do, but now it mocked him from the garage. He felt a sting of shame, a bitter taste of failure. "You're the same old Hank," the voice sneered. "You can't change, just give it up." He almost did. He got up not to go to the garage, but to grab another beer from the fridge to drown out the thought. His hand was on the cold handle when he saw it, reflected in the dark glass of the oven door, his own reflection. Not the grime-streaked one from that terrible night, but still, a man with tired eyes on the verge of giving up on himself again. It wasn't a spark this time. It was a low, burning ember fueled by the shame, by the sheer stubbornness that refused to let that be the end of the story. He didn't grab the beer. He walked past the fridge, past the living room where Sarah was watching a sitcom, and out to the garage. He threw on the main light this time, bathing the dresser in a harsh, unforgiving glow. He looked at the broken drawer slide, the splintered wood where a screw had pulled out. He picked up a chisel and a hammer, then slowly, painstakingly, began to clean out the old, stripped screw hole. He worked until his arms ached, until the small, precise movements required his full concentration, until the thoughts of failure and surrender had been pushed out by the rhythm of work. He didn't finish the repair that night, not even close. But he had not quit. He had simply pushed back. Day 7 brought its own challenges. The initial burst of frustration that had propelled him to the garage had dissipated. Now it was just the sheer drudgery of consistency. He was trying to eat better too, bringing an apple instead of a donut, drinking more water. Sarah noticed. "You all right, Hank?" she'd asked, a slight furrow in her brow. He'd just nodded. He wasn't ready to articulate the war raging inside him. There were days he felt like he was slogging through quicksand, every movement a tremendous effort. He'd catch himself staring blankly at the factory floor, feeling the old emptiness. He'd skip his morning walk sometimes, or go to bed without looking at the dresser at all. He wasn't perfect. He stumbled. He doubted. But each time he stumbled, each time he felt that familiar resignation threatening to swallow him whole, something deeper would kick in. It wasn't always a dramatic realization. Sometimes it was just the memory of the sheer exhaustion of doing nothing, of allowing the apathy to win. Sometimes it was the quiet thought of Emily away at college, making her own way, or Mark, who was starting to look at him with an almost adult curiosity. He couldn't quit on them, and he sure as hell couldn't quit on that flicker he'd felt that night. By day 14, the fight was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface of his days, but it was starting to feel different. Less like an uphill sprint and more like a steady, determined march. He hadn't fixed the dresser yet, but he'd cleaned the slides, gathered the right hardware, even sanded down a rough patch. He hadn't given up on the small changes either. The apple was becoming more routine than the donut. He'd found an old book on basic wiring in the garage and started flipping through it, just for the hell of it, a quiet curiosity replacing the blank stare. He was still Hank, the same tired factory worker, but the fight in his eyes wasn't just for survival anymore. It was for something more. It was for himself. Around day 28, something subtle started to shift. It wasn't a lightning bolt, more like the slow turning of a massive, long-stuck flywheel. Hank still woke before dawn, still pulled on worn jeans, still brewed his coffee. But the quiet hum of his internal battle was starting to sound less like a struggle and more like a rhythm. The dresser, still unfinished, had become a barometer. He didn't just clean the slides, he ordered proper ball-bearing replacements online, a step he'd never considered, always making do. He watched videos, learned a new trick for squaring up drawer fronts. It wasn't about rushing, it was about doing it right, about investing a bit of himself. At the factory, the change was even more noticeable, if only to those who truly paid attention. Charlie, his foreman, a man who measured productivity in grunts, found Hank suggesting a better way to route material on the line, an idea that saved them. An idea that saved them a good 10 minutes per shift, maybe more. Charlie, who always said, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it," just blinked, then grunted. HMMPH. That somehow sounded like approval. He started to notice Hank wasn't just showing up, he was present. He was looking at the machines differently, not just as things that broke, but as puzzles to solve, systems to optimize. At home, Sarah felt it too. It wasn't a dramatic change, no grand pronouncements. It was in the way Hank looked at her when she spoke, truly listening instead of just nodding absently. It was in the steady sound of sanding coming from the garage in the evenings, the methodical tapping of a hammer, the whir of a drill. The dresser wasn't just a broken piece of furniture anymore. It was a project, a commitment. He was pouring himself into it, not with resignation, but with a quiet, almost meditative focus. He even started talking to Mark more, asking about his video games, listening without judgment, sharing a rare laugh. The air around him, once thick with unspoken burdens, seemed to lighten just a fraction. Hope wasn't a sunrise anymore. It was the persistent flicker of a distant porch light. Weeks later, the dresser stood finished in their bedroom, gleaming with a fresh coat of clear varnish, the drawers sliding in and out with silent precision. It was more than just fixed. It was better than new, imbued with a quiet pride. Hank still looked like a man who carried weight, the lines etched deep around his eyes, but they weren't just lines of weariness anymore. They were lines of wisdom, of battles fought and not abandoned. His shoulders, though still broad, seemed to sit a little less hunched. He still went to the factory, still worked the same machines, but his eyes saw more. He saw the intricate dance of gears, the logic of the electrical systems he'd slowly begun to understand from that old wiring book. He'd even taken a night class, just one, on industrial maintenance. It wasn't about escaping the factory. It was about mastering his world within it. He wasn't aiming for the boss's office, just for the satisfaction of doing the best job he could and knowing why it was the best. One evening, sitting on his porch swing, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the rooftops, a cool breeze kicking up the scent of newly mown grass, Hank finally put words to it, not to Sarah, not to anyone, but to himself. "Folks talk about finding yourself," he murmured, the words feeling heavy and true in his mouth. "But for me, it was more about not losing myself in the grind. You just gotta keep pushing, even when you're beat down. That's when you find out what you're really made of. The power ain't outside, it's in that stubborn little voice that says, 'Not today, not ever.'" He saw a glint in the distance, a flicker of light from the town's water tower. It was the same light he'd seen 1,000 times, but tonight it seemed brighter, steadier. There are stories whispered in the hum of factory floors, in the quiet strength of men who rise before the sun, stories not of grand victories, but of relentless perseverance. Hank S. was one of them. He wasn't a king, he wasn't famous, but he was a man who had faced his own personal darkness and refused to let it claim him. He had found his power not in changing his circumstances, but in changing himself. And that, he knew, was a power no circumstance could ever take away. The biggest battles aren't